welcoming you all here today for the first presentation in the 2021 monthly Distinguished Speakers Series, organized by now 8 centers that make up the Network for Economic and Social Trends. And I'm Victoria Esses. I'm director of the network, which we commonly know as NEST. We're really excited about this year's series, which is going to focus on issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we really hope that you'll find the presentations informative, allowing all of us to learn about research that will help to make our society more inclusive and just. Now, before we get started with today's presentation, I would like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Audouinderon peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. And now for today's talk, which is being presented by Huda, Hussein, and myself. It's a great pleasure to introduce Huda Hussein, who is the coordinator for the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership, a position she has held for a little over 12 years. Huda has always been passionate about her work, and she was awarded the Leading Women Building Community Award by the province of Ontario in 2009. In 2011, she was recognized by the government of her country of origin, Yemen, for her role in empowering women in her new home, London, Ontario. Now, as coordinator of the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership, Huda focuses on identifying barriers to immigrant integration, as well as opportunities for success. And this work involves working with various sectors in the community, including NEST here at Western. And today we will be talking about one of the joint projects between the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership and NEST, entitled Discrimination Experienced by Immigrants, Visible Minorities, and Indigenous Peoples in London and Middlesex. And this is an empirical study by the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership. Next slide, and over to you, Huda.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. And thanks, Vicky, for that introduction. I just want to give you a brief information about the Local Immigration Partnership in London, and then what led us to go to that survey or the study that we did together with NEST. So the London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership is a community collaborative that supports and to facilitate the integration of immigrants in all aspects of life. It is one over 180 LIPs or local immigration partnerships across the country. They started initially in London, in Ontario, with 35 of us in Ontario, and then the thing went wide and it became a national project. It's funded since 2009 by Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada. It is supported by the City of London, or by the province, and also co-led by the City of London and a co-chair from the community. Next slide, please. What is the purpose of the LMLIP? As Vicky said, that we do not work by ourselves. We work with the community, with the stakeholders from all walks of life. So it's a kind of a collaborative framework that facilitates successful integration by addressing issues. The issues could be as simple as finding information about housing, or could be as complicated as writing the government about issues that face immigrants, for example, professional interpretation at medical sites. And then the idea is we want to build a stronger, healthier communities. Second slide, please. Next slide. Why do we talk about racism? One of the overarching themes of the LMLIP strategic plan since 2009, or our inception, has been promoting a welcoming community. It's not an easy task to do, but when we bring people together to the table, we can discuss what are the issues, what are the barriers, and then we can together find some kind of solutions. The solutions may be small, but we can find some solutions. The reasons being why I talk about racism. the demographic changes. We are no more the same race everywhere in the city. We are now different. There are so many different categories of people from different parts of the world. The recent events that promote hate and intolerance, we have seen it happening in grocery stores. We have seen it happening in parks in these places. And we cannot forget the last and the tragic attack against our London family in June a few months ago. Next slide, please. What are the opportunities and objectives for us? Here we know that immigration improves our economy, our community, and helps to build the growth in population growth. And we do know that there is racism, and we do know that there is discrimination, and they were under the rug perhaps for a certain time, but they have surfaced recently. So once we acknowledge the problem, we can work together to find solutions for it. So we thought it is time to engage and change the conversation. We wanted to create an atmosphere that encourages inclusion. We wanted to create awareness and educate on different forms of discrimination, including racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination. Next slide, please. This is the study context. The LMLIP has been working on projects to address racism and discrimination for a number of years. For example, you may have heard that every March since 2018, we have been holding these All Are Welcome events. And each year we have a different theme. We talk about discrimination in all its forms. We bring scholars and scientists and researchers to talk about the issues and what can be done with at the community level and at organization level, at an individual level to kind of eliminate these kind of hatred and racism. We have also, you may have also seen the lawn signs which says all are welcome here in dual languages. These are the signs that are created by the London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership, and they are available for free for anybody who wants them. Actually, we are going to launch it again next week. We have also created an Acts of Welcome, 1,000 Acts of Welcome, and we have that campaign site, and we ask people to log in and to sign and insert their sign of welcome, act of welcome. Sorry about that. This work is very important for us, and it is the mandate for all LIPs across the country that is creating a more welcoming community. So the idea was actually, it came from the London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership under the leadership of Vicky Esses. We came up with this idea that we wanted to know what's happening at the local level. We do not have that data, and we needed that data. So we brought that to the Southwestern Ontario LIPs at our meetings, and there was 7 LIPs who have partnered with us, and they have agreed that they will also want to make some kind of studies in their own jurisdiction to find out. We wanted to make sure that when we talk about discrimination, it is there. I mean, we need some kind of data to prove it. We do have data from the bigger towns, but we don't have smaller towns. So that's what set the study for the context. Vicky?
Next slide, please. So as Huda was saying, the purpose of the study was really to gain an in-depth understanding of experiences of discrimination locally. And not just so that we would understand discrimination, but in order to inform the future actions of the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership in its work to address ethnic, racial, and religious discrimination and promote a more welcoming community here in London and Middlesex. Now, while the media make residents aware of high-profile incidents of discrimination in our community, we've all seen those reports. Data on everyday discrimination don't exist at the local level. Some of the data collected by Statistics Canada is broken down for large communities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, but we don't generally get the data for everyday discrimination at the local level. And these data are really needed to support the activities that we're undertaking to counteract discrimination in London and Middlesex. So you may be thinking, we know that there's discrimination here, why not get to the action? But we thought it was really important to have these data, because if we know who exactly is experiencing discrimination, in what context it's occurring, on what basis it's occurring, who's perpetrating this discrimination, what form it takes, and what its potential consequences are, we can do a better job of counteracting it. Next slide, please. So for the study, we were examining, or we were focusing on 3 groups. First of all, immigrants and visible minorities. We included 379 individuals in this category. Now you may be thinking, oh boy, why immigrants and visible minorities together? But in London, over 60% of the sample that we collected were both immigrants and visible minorities. And to disentangle this would be very difficult. Many immigrants are visible minorities, many visible minorities are immigrants. Now, we're not saying they're the same thing. What we're saying is there is a huge overlap. And so for most of the analyses, we combined these two groups. We also included Indigenous peoples in the research, looking at experiences of discrimination. We had 164 Indigenous peoples participating, and we wanted to have a comparison white non-immigrant sample, just to give us some comparison of what's going on with the majority group. And we had 286 people in this group. Now the data were collected by Forum Research for us in March 2021. And it's important to note this was prior to the June 6th attack that I mentioned. What's important about the methodology was that initial contact was made by telephone using random digit dialing in the region. And by doing this, we weren't just asking people who had experienced discrimination to log into our survey. We actually were trying to get a random sample and a relatively representative sample. So Forum basically called people using random digit dialing, and if they fit criteria and agreed to participate, they were sent an online survey to complete. They could complete the survey in English or French, and I should note that we obtained ethics approval from Western University before we commenced any of the research. Same for the other local immigration partnerships that we were partnering with. Next slide, please. So the survey covered a wide variety of topics. And obviously today I can't go into every single topic, but I'll give you an overview. So we were looking at the extent and the context of discrimination. Where is discrimination taking place? Is it taking place in the stores, in the banks, at work, at school? Where is it? What is the basis of discrimination or the presumed basis of discrimination? So what are targets of discrimination saying about why they think they're being discriminated against? Is it based on race or skin color? Is it based on gender, income, etc.? Who do people who are experiencing discrimination say are the primary perpetrators? Is it men? Is it women? What age group, what race or ethnicity is actually targeting them? And then what types of discrimination are they experiencing? So we didn't have an exhaustive list, but we were interested in many of the everyday experiences of discrimination. And so we provided a list of different types of discrimination and asked people who had experienced discrimination whether this fit with what they were experiencing, including things like inappropriate jokes, verbal or physical abuse, verbal or physical threats, etc. So then we asked people what they did to cope with discrimination, and we included both active and passive coping strategies. Active are things like trying to do something about it, talk to somebody about it. Passive are things like ignoring it or just accepting it as the way things are. We looked at people's feelings in response to discrimination, something we don't always do. So how is it making people feel? And this included powerless, shame, excluded, discouraged. We looked at psychological distress, and it's really important to know whether discrimination is leading to anxiety and depression among the targets of discrimination. And finally, something that of course we're really interested in is whether discrimination is affecting and whether groups differ in their feeling of being accepted and welcomed in our community in London and Middlesex. Next slide, please. So this shows the percentage of respondents who have experienced discrimination in one or more contexts in the past 3 years. And you can see among immigrants and visible minorities, it was about 37%. Among Indigenous peoples, it was high. about 62%, and among white non-immigrants, interestingly, about 44% of them said that they had been targets of discrimination in the past 3 years. So you may be puzzled by these findings, and over to the next slide, which helps to explain it a bit more. So when we ask people what the basis of discrimination is, you can see that it actually differs between the groups. So immigrants and visible minorities, and also Indigenous people, we're saying that their experiences of discrimination were based on things like ethnocultural factors related to different minority group statuses, things like their race, their skin color, their Indigenous identity, their ethnicity or culture. In contrast, the comparison white non-immigrants weren't saying that they were discriminated against because they were white. They were saying that they were discriminated more likely because of gender, age, and physical appearance. So it's not the case, and I mean, this maybe shouldn't be surprising. White non-immigrants are experiencing discrimination, but it's based on things like gender and age. I should also mention that although we aimed for a relatively representative sample, the comparison white non-immigrants did tend to be a bit older and more likely to be female. And when we asked people who the perpetrators of discrimination were, they were mainly described as most likely to be white and middle-aged. For immigrants and visible minorities, they were a little bit more likely to be described as women rather than men. And for Indigenous people and the comparison white non-immigrants, they were described as most likely to be men. Next slide, please. So we did a lot of breakdown by demographics. We're just going to show you some of them. So this is broken down by gender. And you can see that for immigrants and visible minorities, women were a bit more likely than men to say they've been discriminated against in the past 3 years. For Indigenous people, and also for the comparison white non-immigrants, men were more likely to report experiencing discrimination than women. Next slide, please. What about age? So this is broken down by age. And again, you can see for the immigrants and visible minorities, younger people are more likely to be reporting discrimination than older people. Same for the white non-immigrants. Younger people more likely to report discrimination. But for Indigenous people were more likely, older Indigenous people were more likely to be reporting discrimination, over 80%. Now, I should say that the sample for Indigenous people is smaller, so this is suggestive only, but it is noteworthy that for Indigenous people, as they get older, it seems that experiences of discrimination are going up. Whereas for the other two groups, it's the opposite. Next slide, please. We thought it was really interesting that highest level of education seemed to be influencing whether people had experienced discrimination. And if you look at the immigrants and visible minorities and also Indigenous peoples, it's those with a graduate or professional degree who are especially likely to be reporting that they're experiencing discrimination. So people who are very well educated, especially likely to be saying that they are experiencing discrimination. You know, among Indigenous people, the levels are high irrespective, but it is noteworthy that it's even higher for those with a graduate and professional degree. Next slide, please. Look back one, please. So for the immigrant and visible minority group, we broke it down by religion. Where possible to classify people into different religious groups. We couldn't actually include every religious group because the sample sizes got too small. But what you can see is that among immigrants and visible minorities, Sikhs were especially likely to be reporting discrimination. And Christians at the bottom there, 30%. Next slide, please. And consistent with this, when we broke it down by ethnicity or race, it was South Asians who were especially likely to be saying that they had experienced discrimination in the last 3 years. Next slide, please. Oops, back one. We also looked at how long people had been in Canada, and maybe this is slightly reassuring, that the longer immigrants had been in Canada, the less likely they were to be experiencing discrimination, or at least reporting that they're experiencing discrimination. So it's the newcomers who'd been in Canada less than 5 years who were most likely to be reporting that they had experienced discrimination in London and Middlesex in the last 3 years. Next slide, please. Okay, some of the nitty-gritty, which I think is extremely interesting, is the context in which discrimination is occurring. So this is for immigrants and visible minorities. And when you look at the context in which people are experiencing discrimination, you can see that when attending school or classes comes out at the top of the list. Don't forget, these are adults, so these are schools for adults. And they're most likely to be reporting discrimination, immigrants and visible minorities in school or classes, followed by work settings. When applying for a job or promotion or at their job, from supervisors, coworkers, clients. This is something that surprised me a bit, which is public transit. While using public transit, such as buses, trains, or taxis, again, immigrants and visible minorities are experiencing discrimination. And then fifth on this list, at the top of the list, is in a store, bank, or restaurant. So this is public places, right, where you might go, quite a few times a week. And people are experiencing discrimination in these contexts. Next slide, please. What about Indigenous people? At the top of the list for this group, almost 30% are experiencing discrimination in public areas, such as parks and sidewalks. Maybe I should have known this, but I certainly didn't. And this was an eye-opener for me. And then, of course, these employment settings come up again. So at your job, from supervisors, coworkers, or clients, when applying for a job or promotion, and then public transit comes up again while using public transit, such as buses, trains, or taxis. In a store, bank, or restaurant, again, another relatively public setting. And then when attending school or classes. I just find this really interesting in terms of the work that we do and where we might think about targeting our anti-discrimination efforts. So we might have known about employment for a long time, but some of these other contexts, I at least wouldn't have guessed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we asked people who had experienced discrimination whether the discrimination basically constituted these different forms. You can see it's not exhaustive, but it was sort of the everyday discrimination that people might experience. And you can see for immigrants and visible minorities that at the top of the list, for those who had experienced discrimination, 59% said inappropriate jokes. And then about 58% said derogatory language, followed by verbal abuse and verbal threats. Next slide, please. What about Indigenous people? Now, in this case, almost 60% of Indigenous people who had experienced discrimination talked about derogatory language, these slights. About 50% talked about these inappropriate jokes. This was followed by verbal abuse, so being called names or being talked to in a bad way, but also physical threat. And I think this is quite noteworthy. 29% said they had experienced physical threats in the last 3 years in London and Middlesex in our community. One of the questions we were interested in was whether experiences of discrimination have increased during the pandemic. And we actually thought they would be for certain groups. But don't forget, people have been in lockdown, so they haven't had a lot of interaction with others. You can see that white non-immigrants showed the greatest decrease in experiencing discrimination, or said that they had experienced the greatest decrease in experiencing discrimination during the pandemic. This was followed by immigrants and visible minorities. They also had gone down in experiencing discrimination, and then Indigenous peoples. So I was a bit surprised by this, but when you think about it, there's a lot less social contact between people. People aren't out on the streets. Our streets are empty, and especially, you know, early in the pandemic. And so there's less opportunity for these discrimination episodes. Next slide, please. So what are people saying they do in response to discrimination? And as you'll remember, I mentioned that we looked at use of both active and passive coping strategies in response to discrimination. So for those who had experienced discrimination, we asked them a list, you know, a long list of things that they might have done. And these were factored into active and passive coping strategies. And you can see across the board that people are more likely to use the passive coping strategies than the active ones. They're more likely to ignore it, to just accept it as the way it is, than to actually, I don't know, try to do something about it or talk to somebody about it. And this is a bit worrying because we know the passive coping strategies can lead to more internalization. Next slide. So what about how this makes people feel? So those who said they'd experienced discrimination in the past 3 years were asked about some of their feelings about it. And again, they were asked a number of emotions related to anxiety and depression, factored into anxiety and depression. And you can see that across the board, people are experiencing anxiety and depression in response to discrimination. Indigenous people especially likely to be experiencing these quite negative emotions. Next slide, please. So we were really interested in how people feel about their community and whether discrimination led people to be feeling less accepted and welcome in London, Middlesex. And you can see that for immigrants and visible minorities, this wasn't the case. There's not really big differences between those who had said they had experienced discrimination and those who hadn't. But overall, those two groups express lower feelings of acceptance and welcome in London and Middlesex than white non-immigrants. So they're feeling overall less accepted and welcome in the community. You can also see that only for the white non-immigrants, having experienced discrimination makes people feel a little bit less accepted and welcome. But immigrants and visible minorities and Indigenous people are feeling this across the board. So there's lots more data that came out of this report. I just want to talk briefly about some of the recommendations that we've made based on these findings, and also based on the literature on strategies for counteracting discrimination. So the first recommendation is to promote an environment that encourages victims of discrimination to report their experiences, acknowledging the discrimination in our community and being able to express what you've experienced is very important, both for the community and for people who are having these experiences. And, you know, the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership actually, earlier this year, before we started this research, was thinking about where people report discrimination, and there really isn't a central location for reporting discrimination or a place to report discrimination. We came up with some lists, but they were kind of very dispersed. Unless you're reporting crimes, right? If you've experienced something that you think is a hate crime, it's easier, you can go to the police. But if somebody has called you names, they've yelled jokes at you, or they've yelled threats at you on the street, what do you do? And what we've noticed is that a number of communities across Canada are starting these online reporting tools where people can go in, either who've experienced discrimination or who've witnessed discrimination, and have they're able to go in and actually report on the discrimination that they're experiencing or that they've witnessed. And, this isn't only an outlet for people to express themselves, it's also a way of us knowing what's going on in our community in a more regular basis than, just conducting a survey every once in a while. So our first recommendation is really to develop an online reporting tool at the city level, at the university level, I should say, and in different places in the community, perhaps centralized in some way. Our second recommendation has to do with helping victims of discrimination to really use effective coping strategies. As I mentioned, active coping strategies overall tend to be more effective, and you saw that people were more likely to use passive than active, but it does depend on individual characteristics. So it is really important that we be training people to use coping strategies that are going to be effective for them, and to give them a tool that they can kind of figure out what is going to work for them, right? How they're going to be able to cope with this discrimination they're experiencing so that they don't internalize it. But of course, we don't want to put the onus only on those who are experiencing discrimination to do something about it. That really, to me, does not seem like a satisfactory solution. And so if you go to the next slide, our third recommendation has to really do with engaging in effective initiatives to prevent and reduce discrimination based on what we now know. So, the study basically showed that there are some contexts where discrimination is happening more frequently, like employment settings all over the place, right? For all groups, employment settings are really near the top of the list for where discrimination is occurring, whether it's in getting a job or being promoted or in your employment setting. In schools, so maybe that's something that our university should be thinking about, that we really need to be thinking about the university or the college or other, adult education centers as places where we need to do more to prevent and reduce discrimination. And then the public areas, such as parks and sidewalks. Something I perhaps wouldn't have thought about, but is really key if we're going to make London and Middlesex more welcoming. On public transit. So what strategies are we going to develop to ensure that when different groups are on public transit, they're not being exposed to discrimination in their everyday lives, and even in stores, banks, and restaurants. The places we go to shop, to worry about our finances in restaurants, we need to think about anti-discrimination initiatives in these contexts. I think it's important, and maybe we already knew this, but this reinforces who the perpetrators of discrimination are. So, the reported perpetrators were middle-aged whites, both men and women. And if we are going to do anything about discrimination, these people have to be included in our anti-discrimination programming in order that it will be effective. So, some of us who kind of acknowledge discrimination in our community are willing to go to these trainings and engage in these experiences. But if the people who are perpetrating these acts aren't actually involved, things won't improve that much. Next slide, please. I think it's really important to think about the types of discrimination that are taking place in our community. And the dominant types of discrimination that were reported included inappropriate jokes, derogatory language, and verbal abuse. And in everyday life, many people, I think, would discount these as acts of discrimination, but they are discrimination. They're often considered to be microaggressions. Some people would say, oh, they're not important, they're not intended, but they're still hurting people. For immigrants and visible minorities, verbal threats were important, being told things that they found threatening. And for Indigenous peoples, physical threat. And that's really important to know about if we're going to do anything about discrimination in our community. Next slide, please. Over to you, Huda.
Thank you, Vicky. Well, now that we know what we know, what are we going to do with these facts and these reports and the results? We will be taking into consideration the strategies or the recommendations that we just read to us by Vicky. From our side, we'll be disseminating the findings widely. We will also work on the lawn science and the bystander intervention tips that we have created. These are the tips that tells you what to do and what not to do when you face discrimination or when you see an act of discrimination. We will have our welcome annual events focused and targeted now that we know what we need to do. We will also think about developing and testing an action-oriented anti-racism toolkit. We are hoping also, as Vicky said, to find funding to have a online reporting system where such activities can be reported. Something that also we have been working on with the local immigration partnership is doing a youth forum in 2022 for 2022, which will bring, it's a kind of workshop to facilitate the relationship between immigrants and Indigenous peoples. So one of the items that was in the report is discrimination also happens in school. So this could be one act of addressing that issue. We will also be working with other local immigration partnerships on joint activities once the reports are out and we will know what activities we can do together. And as Vicky said, we will try to include those who are not engaged, those who are disengaged, or what we call the perpetrators. So usually we talk to our own, among our own people, among our own communities, but we need to include those people in these sessions. Thank you.
Next slide.
So the full report is available on our website for anybody who wants that. So you can access it, or you can send me an email or Vicky an email, and we can send that to you too.
Great, thank you. And we are now open to questions. And maybe we could stop sharing the PowerPoint so that we can see everybody and answer your questions. You can raise your hand either physically, or is there a raise? Yeah, there's a raise hand. Karen.
Hi, Huda and Vicky. So this is great, and thank you. And I was trying to take notes, quickly there, but I'm sure I'll go back to the written report and fill in the details. I was noticing that the things that you're asking about in the survey were, let's say, kind of, how do I say, individual incidents that people could think about. Was there any concern with asking about more systemic or institutional forms of discrimination that people might not be able to articulate in the same way as, somebody said something or did something to me in a specific moment?
So that's a good question. I mean, we were looking at individual acts of discrimination. I mean, asking individuals about systemic discrimination that they're experiencing, it's very hard for them to report on that. On the other hand, our recommendations do include some recommendations at the systemic level. We're not discounting that. We think it's extremely important, but this study wasn't focusing specifically on that, although our recommendations do talk about systemic discrimination.
Okay, just to see if it's acknowledged somewhere that, that, like, this is sort of one piece of it, right? Thanks.
Of course. Thank you. Come on, don't be shy. We love questions.
So I was wondering if you could maybe just say a bit more about the gender dimension. Just an open-ended question. Anything that struck you? It sort of occurred to me when you were talking about middle-aged whites as recipients of discrimination. My immediate thought was gender, although you mentioned some other universal traits as well. So I wonder if you could say more about that.
For sure. So when you look at the gender discrimination reported by white non-immigrants, it's mainly women. And again, as I said, it's a bit of an older sample in that group. And so it's not surprising to me that they are reporting gender discrimination. I don't know if that's what your question was about, but that was specifically for the non-immigrant whites, that we were saying that group was reporting, you know, gender, age discrimination, things like physical appearance.
Yeah, I mean, part of what struck me as well from the empirical data was the labor force implications. So in the workplace or at a job interview. And that seemed to be pretty consistent across the groups, right? As two of the 3 or 4 highest bars.
Right.
And is there a gender split there, for example, or?
So we couldn't really break everything down by, for example, gender, because the sample sizes just get smaller and smaller. You know, so for each context, for example, the sample sizes get smaller because everybody wasn't reporting discrimination in every context, obviously. But what I would say is that you might expect that the white non-immigrants are experiencing gender discrimination, yes, but also age discrimination at the top and the bottom end of the spectrum, right? Young people feeling that they're discriminated against, but also older people trying to maybe find new jobs, you know, get back into the workforce. I think there was a question in the chat. Laurel Shire, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, I can ask it. I am a grad chair here at Western, and I'm working with an international MA student who has been waiting for a long time to get a student visa. It's finally been approved, and he's now going to arrive here in London in mid-October. And I just learned today that he's really struggling to find housing in London because he has been referred to 4 different landlords by our off-campus housing unit on campus. And each time they ask him what his nationality is, and as soon as they find out that he's coming from an African country, they stop returning his messages. So, not surprising, but very disappointing. I'm not sure how to help him. And I wondered if the local immigration partnership had any advice. I mean, yes, this is against the Ontario Human Rights Code and illegal, but that doesn't help him find a place to live. So should I be, you know, contacting landlords on his behalf? And you know, what can we do?
Yeah, I can take that question. You may contact landlords on his behalf. This has happened at the last, Vicky, you would remember at the last housing issues that we had, somebody contacted the landlord, but having listened to the person coming from another place, they would not give the person the housing until someone else intervened and contacted that same landlord, and the house was available in the same 5 minutes difference. So you can do that, one. Or you can send me an email, then I can connect you with one of the landlords that we have awarded last year some award, and they are very happy. They will be happy to help you, I think.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you.
Do this. You're welcome.
Leanne.
I think she's muted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go on to, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Oh,
My microphone's up.
okay, why don't you go then? Leanne?
My microphone's up. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to ask you about the bystander training that you're going to offer. Is this going to be, you said that you need to include people who fall into the demographic, the white men and women, middle-aged people. But is this training going to be open like to the general public? Because that's something that I would be interested in participating in. I know that quite often people are kind of afraid to intervene when they see something like that happen because they don't want to become the targets, and they also don't want to risk being, physically attacked themselves. Because I've seen something like this happen, and I was very upset about what was going on, but I was afraid to say anything because the people who were discriminating against this young man, there were several of them in that group, and they were being very aggressive.
So first of all, Huda, should I respond to some of this? Okay, so it isn't training right now. We don't have the funding yet for that, but it is a set of tips for what people can do that is going to be handed out and advertised on the radio. And you're right. I mean, your experience is a very prototypical experience where even people who are allies and bystanders who want to do something, they don't know what to do, right?
Yeah.
And they're afraid they won't be effective. And so we're hoping that these tips, and maybe later, once we start developing a toolkit, will allow people to know what to do. So the tips are only really a first step, some ideas of what people can do when they see something like this happening. One of the tips is to record it. Turn your phone on and get a recording of it. Even asking the person who's been being discriminated against whether they'd like you to walk with them somewhere. But the tips also say that you want to make sure that you stay safe, right? You don't want to become like two victims of discrimination. So
Right.
The tips are really just some really basic things people can do as bystanders.
So if you do make a recording of the incident, then what do you do with that?
Well, then you have to ask the person who's been discriminated against for permission, but they may want that as evidence, and they may want to go to the police or report it.
Okay.
And given them now a tool, but I wouldn't actually do anything with that recording without their permission. It's important that they give you permission.
Right, of course, of
But
course.
you've given them a tool now to report it, some evidence to back up what they're, what they may want to say.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And just to add to what you said, Vicky, the tips are now on the webpage, on our LMLIP webpage. You can see, you can have it there, you can see it there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Adira.
Hi, thank you both so much for your presentation. I was just wondering from more of that researcher perspective, did you measure how long the Indigenous or immigrant populations had lived in London before they completed the study?
We did. I don't have those findings at my fingertips, but they're in the report.
Okay.
Length of time of living in London. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Other questions? Comments, suggestions, ideas? Karen.
I'm back. I was also thinking, I'm assuming that your respondents were all adults, is that right?
Yes.
Because I think it would be interesting to get data from children in terms of who the perpetrators are. If you're saying middle-aged, people, partly because that's, I think, because you're dealing with adults. So children, I think, would maybe report other children or younger people as also engaging in this type of discrimination, or and I mean, it would be a different study, but I just think that would be an interesting kind of follow-up if you could manage to get ethics approval and so on to do it with children and see, because I think that's an important population for this, because those early experiences have such an effect on the whole rest of how they feel welcomed and belonging and all of these kind of things, how they move on in their lives, right? So and I think children are, particularly vulnerable because they're young, right? They're kids. They don't know how to make sense of these things, and they're in schools, and there's all kinds of, if you want to say, bullying or teasing or discrimination, various things that go on. yeah, I just think it's important, if possible for the future, I guess, to look at children as a population here.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And as Huda said, we are planning this forum in the spring. And it's interesting, it's for high school students, and it's based on the fact that there was actually conflict between Indigenous, immigrant, minority kids at certain high schools. It was in the papers.
Yeah.
And so we are bringing those kids together to give them a chance to get to know each other and their respective cultures, and to do common activities together. We know common activities help, to improve the situation. But yeah, doing the research with children would be, I think, interesting and important. Michael.
Thank you. Your comment about the difference between active and passive coping. The passive part got me to thinking about, well, what are people doing in absorbing whatever it is that they're facing. But then, and I forget the overall sample size was, it seemed like it was around 830 or 840 subjects.
Yeah, 829. Yeah.
829. So do you have any sense at all? I know it's probably impossible to comment on, but so if you had a woman at a job interview who got an inappropriate joke because the perception was this is not the kind of work she should be applying for, or something like that, and she absorbs that, but do you have any sense of how many people, you have 829, but how many people wouldn't bother with a survey like this because they're just in the mode of passively absorbing and coping, and so actually the scale of the problem could be quite different out there?
For sure. So we don't have a record of how many people didn't do the survey. Because it was an iterative process, right? Forum called people, did random digit dialing. Some people don't answer. People answer, hang up before they hear the questions, or the inclusion questions. So we didn't keep track of all of that. But of course, you're right. It isn't I would say this is the best we could do to get representative samples by using that random digit dialing. And the samples for Indigenous was a lot larger than we usually get. The sample of immigrants and visible minority was a lot more kind of representative of what that population looks like than we might usually get. But the white non-immigrants, as I said, they're more likely to be women, and they're more likely to be older than a random sample would look like.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I'm not trying to pick it apart, but
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the other things that occurred to me is given that some people must be in a mode of sort of passively coping, to what extent, like I don't know how forum research did it, but if there were questions that tried to indicate, inappropriate jokes, given the different backgrounds of the subjects in the study, was there a shared understanding of what an inappropriate joke would be? Or were there prompts for that, or?
There wasn't, because that part was in a survey, a written survey that they did. And so there weren't prompts, and it was however they interpreted that in the context of discrimination. I should say the questions asked if you've ever been treated, if you've ever been discriminated against or treated unfairly. So we tried to explain a little bit about what we meant by discrimination, but we didn't want to be leading either.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you.
Vanessa, did you want to ask your question? Where is Vanessa? There.
Yes. So my question was again about the coping strategy, and especially because you talk about how passive coping strategy lead to this process of internalization. And as an immigrant and a visible minority myself, I know that in the community, sometimes people tend to tick those microaggression as random or benign or non-important, but with time it builds up and it leads to that feeling of powerlessness, of feeling of being defeated. So what are the most effective, active coping strategy that came out of this study that people use?
So I should say that we didn't actually look at, we just looked at whether people had used active and passive coping strategies. We didn't actually look at their effectiveness, nor did we do any research, testing which strategies work. Why I'm saying that active strategies are more effective than passive overall, that isn't always the case, is because that's what the literature suggests. And so I can definitely send you some of that literature related to coping strategies, but it's more clinical than my area of expertise. So I can send you stuff for sure.
Thank you, that'd be great.
Christian.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if I maybe missed this throughout the presentation. What are the plans for trying to disseminate the information, to other individuals within our community that are, have decision-making power with, at the city level and other organizations to influence, obviously, their decisions and et cetera?
Huda, I can leave that to you because we've got a whole plan.
We do. Actually, we are now identified a number of sessions that we'll be doing across the city with the leaders. I mean, talking about the City of London, talking about the hospitals, institutions, bigger institutions, community leaders. And then we'll also talk about, we'll also deliver these sessions to groups like community groups, like the grocery stores, the banks, and these people. So there is a plan that we are working on. Next week, we'll be having those plans ready we are hoping that by mid-October, we'll start these sessions of informing those who have, not only who have the decisions, but also in the community at large.
Yeah, and this has been presented to City Council, right? Was it this week or last?
It was on the 21st of September. It was included in their agenda.
Right.
But what we wanted to do is a presentation so
Right.
that people see it and this is the results. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions, comments, suggestions? I like the suggestion of looking at children. Something we'll have to think about. Rama.
Hello. Yes, I'm sorry if it's a little too loud around me. I just wanted to say thank you again for the talk. It was very insightful. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or speculations about the element of the education. I was more wondering like whether it is the post-secondary education kind of gives people knowledge or skills to identify certain jokes and microaggressions as acts of discrimination, or if it is some other completely non-related reason as to why like more educated people seem to experience or report experiences of discrimination more than others.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, I mean, I think there's two aspects of this. We do know that people with a liberal arts education are more informed about discrimination and, equality and are more likely to show, I would have said more liberal attitudes, but maybe more awareness of what those acts are. I would also say, for the two groups, for immigrants coming into Canada, those with high levels of education probably are the most frustrated because we know that there's a lot of skills discounting going on where their skills are not recognized in Canada. And so I'm not surprised that that group is showing high levels of discrimination. I would say skills discounting on its own, when groups can't get their skills recognized, is a problem. But then, you know, for Indigenous people, maybe it's a bit of a counter expectation that people don't expect them to be in these, you know, well-educated in these positions of authority or in these positions, high-level positions in organizations, and they get discriminated against because of the expectation that they won't be educated, right? Or the stereotype about that.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
Other questions or suggestions, ideas? So we encourage you to look at the full report, which is on the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership website. Next week, we are starting the signs and bystander tip campaign. You'll hear ads on the radio for that. And the signs and the tips are being distributed for free. As Huda mentioned, there is the 1000actsofwelcome.ca. Is that right, Huda? 1000actsofwelcome.ca website.
Correct.
We encourage you to go look at that. It has a lot of information about strategies for counteracting discrimination and racism. And if you have more questions, please just email us. We would be happy to continue this dialogue. Obviously, we're very passionate about this work. On that note, I should also thank Mamta Vaswani, who is actually the prime researcher on this project. Mamta has done a great job on that report. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming today. And we look forward to hearing from you further.